Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to Trine Time Astrology with Alex, Lars, and me, James. Today, we're going to be talking about the upcoming Scorpio New Moon on Friday, November 17th. And we're also going to discuss briefly lunations and what they mean in general. Um, Let's see. Alex, would you like to start us off with some thoughts about lunations?
Well, I mean, I'm not really an expert on lunations. What I do, I am a Cancer, so I am quite influenced by the moon. So I know how the cycles of the moon kind of work from that perspective. I don't know too much technical theory about it, but I can give you my insight from that point of view.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
from what I feel and from what many people feel that I work with, even, the full moon is more of that, period where you want to get out there, you want to express something comes to fruition. We know that the full moon is like the part of the cycle where things, energies come to a certain completion, right? But many times we see articles written on the new moon. For example, if it's the new moon in Aries, saying that, well, today it's the new moon in Aries or in Leo, you want to get out there and take action. But regardless of the sign, the new moon is never a time to take action in a specific direction. Uh, Not never. I would not say never. There's specific particularities about it, but the new moon is really something more inwardly oriented than the full moon, which is more outwardly oriented, bringing from the unmanifest to the manifest. That's the full moon. And the new moon kind of draws things from the manifest back to the unmanifest. If you compare the moon with the individual being, the individual rate of consciousness, the new moon is conjunct the sun, and the being is born, it grows, it becomes full, right? The zenith of life. Then it starts to fade and shrink, and then it dies. And when it dies, what happens? It becomes one with the source, which is the sun. It's united with the sun, and there's no duality. There's no two bright objects. There's just one, which is the sun. So for me, the new moon is a period to go inward, to seek things inward. And if you can set an intention for things that you would like manifest in your life, that's a good thing to do with the new moon. Where many people kind of ruin their, their plans, I guess, is where they try to take some kind of action with the new moon. They set the intention and they immediately try to implement that to kind of get a hold of this energy of the new moon. And especially if you do this before the moon is reborn, then you're almost sure to ruin whatever you were planning to do. So that's kind of my initial thought on this. The new moon is more about going inward, either setting intentions or, more importantly, clearing things to make way for something which you would like to manifest in the upcoming period.
Cool. Thanks. Lars, what are your thoughts about the lunar phases?
Yeah, cool. I pretty much agree with everything Alex said, and I'll just see if I can add a few things. I wanted to just read a couple sentences by Dane Rudyard from the Lunation Cycle. He says, "The new moon is the starting point of the realm of life. The full moon opens up the realm of man's spiritual identity, of man's individual immortality." And so basically, it kind of brings us back to this idea between like waxing and waning. The new moon is like the aces in the tarot pips. You know, something is stirring below the surface. It's the beginning of conception. The seed is just beginning to, to break its little tendrils out and plant in the dirt and stuff. And so it's a time where the moon is symbolically being like fecundated by the spiritual will represented by the sun. And then we have this growth period, so this realm of life where forms are being built up, where things are being grown. And that's why the waxing moon is considered to be benefic, because it wants to grow things. And while it's dark, it can't really grow things. It just stirs up. Hence what you were saying, Alex, about, it's not really it's a better time to set intentions. Because yeah, before the moon, up until the moon is about, some people would say like 70, 72 degrees away from the sun. It's still a little too dark for things to actually take shape. But then as it gets especially to the first quarter, things really start to take shape and form. And then the full moon initiates the waning phase, which deals with consciousness and also with dissolution. So the waning moon is considered malefic because it deals with dissolving the forms that were built in the first part of the hemicycle. And that's why Rudyard associates it with man's spiritual identity, because once you have built up this sort of this body, and it's called the diamond body mystically, or the rainbow body, then basically now it's time to disseminate or share that radiance and that spirit, and that's the waning cycle. So that's the part of sacrifice. And the balsamic phase, which is right before the new moon, is kind of like a very 12th house phase, where like we're bringing things to an end, we're closing out accounts, metaphorically speaking, and we're focusing on the seed that will then start to burst open at the new moon.
Right.
So that's kind of that's my thoughts on it.
Right, and those are, of course, like it's always neat to see this, how it works with all of us. But that's the analogy I was thinking of, was this idea of a seed. And at the new moon, it's like the idea that the seed is planted, and then like at the halfway point in the cycle, then the seed is kind of like germinated, and then at the full moon, the seed sprouts and comes out of the earth. And I think that it's actually really interesting, because I was also thinking about it from the perspective of human life and cycles in life. And as we know, we can look at things like the progressed lunar phases. So that being like, based on a calculation in astrology that shows us, where you are in your phases in life. But also, like at the new moon, I think that it's interesting to conceive of it as like the actual moment when your spirit enters your body in life, and then at the full moon, that being like the time in which your spiritual self kind of like is born, right? So it's this idea of birth. You're breaking through the earth, so like the womb, and you're coming into this world. And then at the end, at the balsamic phase of this lunation cycle, that would be representative of like death and returning back to the source from which you came.
Yeah.
The sun representing like the source, the moon representing the soul of men and women, of humanity. So I think those are really good analogies that we can that people can perhaps think about in considering these ideas.
Yeah.
And so I am going to actually share my screen, and what I have, what this is the event chart for the Scorpio New Moon based on Pacific time. So the time might vary, or what the time will vary depending upon your location. But this chart's just set up with the moon being the focal point on the first house. So I'll just share that with everyone. 1 second. So this is the chart. And let's see. So Alex, what are your impressions of this upcoming lunation? And I said the wrong thing too. Sorry, let me correct myself. I said November 17th. It's actually here. It'll be the early morning of the 18th. So
yeah, where I am as well here in Europe, it will be about midday on the 18th. So I guess it's just about the 18th everywhere on the world.
Right.
What I first noticed about this, new moon, besides everything else, let me not get into too much detail here, is the fact that Venus and Jupiter are in the same sign as the moon. And of course, there's the fact that, as Lars pointed out in our earlier discussion, that there are malefics on both sides, and then the moon is void, which Lars will probably cover more of. But the fact that Jupiter and Venus is in Scorpio to me is very important, because that's a huge benefic presence right there in Scorpio with this new moon. Now, the new moon in Scorpio is going to be perceived as a bit dark, as kind of going in depth and bringing out some dark forces, some dark energies. It may bring our attention to some darkness that we have in ourselves. And of course, the Scorpio is a sign of depth, right? That's why what I associate Scorpio with. It's like, Mars projecting. Mars is the planet that projects, that is kind of throws energy, shoots energy, and Aries is the sign where Mars projects it in the outer world, where Mars goes headlong in the outer world, whereas Scorpio is the sign where Mars projects that focuses that beam of energy, of fire, in the inner world, towards the inside. And so a massive introspection is in order for anyone with this new moon. You can pretty much ride a wave towards your inner dimensions and find things which you may have never thought you would find in there, right? And because Jupiter and Venus are both in Scorpio, of course, this could lead to relationship themes and whatnot. But to me, really, Jupiter and Venus being in there and the new moon in Scorpio really says emotional / psychological healing. That's pretty much what this new moon says to me. But as always with the new moon, right, the energy of the new moon is much more under our control than that of any other planet, because it's faster than any other planet. So it's kind of our job to go for this process of healing, or to access our inner dimensions where we feel that we may still carry some emotional, psychological wounding, because there is really a good chance here of healing and clearing out and bringing to the surface things which may have been hidden for a long time. So that's my initial thought on this.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Lars, what are you thinking about this?
Well, there's just so much here as always. So I'll try my best to make my initial comments brief. One of the big things, I'll just expand, I guess, off what Alex said a bit. The Jupiter Venus, both benefics conjunct, is potentially very auspicious, and it's made even more auspicious because they're forming what is called a Raj Yoga, which means that basically Jupiter is ruling a trine, the 5th house, and Venus is ruling an angle, the 7th house. And the other signs they rule, the other houses they rule, are not going to interfere according to these kind of strict rules outlined in Jyotish. So it's very interesting because the Raj Yogas have to do generally with just auspiciousness and wealth and things and gains and abundance and fortune. And it's even more prevalent because it's the two benefics. So it's not going to necessarily come by hard work and effort. But at the same time, Mars is the ascendant lord in the 12th house, and Venus and Mars are in parivartana, which means they're exchanging signs. And that factor may mar some of the great good things that could be coming into our life. So the way I interpret that as in a generic, new moon way or full moon way is like, we should be careful not to let the great things that are coming into our life be spoiled by our fears and our worries and our phobias and feeling isolated and things like that. And another thing that sort of adds to this is that the moon and sun are opposite the star Algol almost exactly, and same with Mercury being opposite the star Rigel. And both of those, the fact that it's opposition rather than conjunction, it's like it could suggest we could be focusing on like difficult events that are happening around us or in the world, not necessarily directly to us. I mean, there's already
Right.
been another, there's already been another couple of, well, actually something like 30 mass shootings since the Las Vegas one. And of course, Algol is about, losing one's head. It's sort of a metaphor for when we lose ourselves to materialism. Medusa represents the pull of materialism, and so her head has to be chopped off. If we don't do it, the universe will do it for us. And Rigel, being related to Orion's foot, also deals kind of with a similar theme, but it deals more with pride and arrogance. Orion thought he could destroy all the beasts on the planet, instead of taking the grace that he had when his eyesight was restored miraculously. He started boasting about, I can take down any of the beasts. And so then the scorpion was sent to sting him in the foot and kill him. So it's kind of like this chart like is sort of like screaming something like that to me, of like, there's potentially all this great stuff that could be coming with that Raj Yoga Jupiter Venus conjunction, but then there may be a tendency for us to want to spoil it or focus on the horrors of the world. But in, mystically speaking, this is where we get lost in our ego and our sense of morality, because in reality, everything is just the play of God. Everything is just God manifest. So anyway, yeah.
Well,
James?
and then also, I'm just going to adjust the chart a little bit. Okay. So also, I think that one of the things I wanted to kind of like briefly mention is like the concept of benefic versus malefic. And, the way that I associate benefic is the idea of goodness and increasing things and bringing people together. And then malefic being this idea of loss and decreasing things and separating things, right? So pushing things apart or destroying things. So I just wanted to kind of like throw that out for people who are listening in case, you're not that familiar with the idea of malefic and benefic. And then also, I think it's really important to consider that I think relationships will be a primary focus here, going off what Alex said, but then, and Lars, especially because of Jupiter and Venus being so close to one another during the lunation, and Mars being the ruler of the lunation. But Mars is in Libra, the sign of relationships and harmony and balance and how we work with others and how we get along with others. And Mars is actually making a pretty tight sextile to Mercury, or Mercury is making a rather tight sextile to Mars, I should say. And then Mars is making a square aspect to Pluto. So what this really makes me think of is the idea that in order to get along with others, we really need to speak our truth and be passionate, but do so in a way that is also loving and brings people together instead of separating them. And be careful not to get into power struggles within your relationships during, the coming month, because you can have some powerful experiences with others, or but that doesn't mean that it's going to be good or bad. I think that it really means that it's going to manifest however you choose to use it. And it kind of goes back to also this idea of facing your fears and not being looking into the eyes of Medusa and not being petrified by what you're afraid of, but actually, using wisdom and using discretion in a way that you can conquer your fears. So, and then that can propel you forward. Anyway, so those are just some of my initial thoughts about this.
James, I just gotta cut in here at a turn slightly, because what you said, it's amazing, because it exactly mirrors what I felt like some of the key nakshatras were showing.
Well, and mirrors is interesting you say, because, this idea that the shield mirror, and he was able to, avoid he was able to like see Medusa without looking into her eyes, right? Wasn't it
Yeah.
Perseus or
Yeah. Perseus. Yeah. That he used the shield as like a mirror to
right?
not
Oh,
directly look at her.
that's a good thought too. Real quick, is the idea that
Sure.
to remember that oftentimes in life, the things that we're afraid of are really just mirror images of things within that we haven't fully dealt with on that internal level. And so
Sure.
I just wanted to say that anyway.
Yeah, just real quick on these nakshatras. So the new moon is happening in Vaishak nakshatra, but then within like less than a degree, it's going to move into the next nakshatra called Anuradha. And so where this thing about friendship comes in is like Vaishak, the deity for that is Indra and Agni, and Indra is the king of the gods, and Agni is the divine fire. So it's kind of like this super powerful king that is just going to do whatever needs to be done. And the description I have of this nakshatra is that sometimes it creates difficulties in relating to other people because it's like the
right.
king on the throne, he doesn't
Of
really
course it does.
mingle, right? And then but then the moon's going to move into Anuradha like right away, and that one, the deity is Mitra, which is responsible for friendship and partnership. And so Mitra and Vaishak are actually very similar nakshatras in many ways, but Mitra also has the ability to like bring that kingly vision and power down and relate it to people.
This is so perfect.
So really cool that you said that, and
Wow.
that's why I had to cut in line here. But I want to give Alex another chance to speak now.
No, that's really cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, I get kind of like, chills whenever you said that, because it's like, it's amazing how we can look at these things from different perspectives and still draw on some sort of like hidden truth, right? Some sort of deeper truth. But anyway, thanks so much for telling me about it. And that's powerful.
Yeah.
Alex, what are you thinking?
So I've just had a bunch of thoughts that I've kind of built off of what you guys were saying, which is all quite awesome. And first thing that came to mind is that Lars, you mentioned the Raj Yoga that forms if we take the moon as the ascendant in this chart by Venus and Jupiter, but there is also a arguably more powerful Raj Yoga formed by the sun and the moon.
That's true. Yeah, that is true.
Because the moon represents the 9th house and the sun is the 10th house. And whenever you have a Raj Yoga forming, if the node is in one of the angles, especially Rahu is in one of the angles forming the Raj Yoga, then that Raj Yoga becomes even more powerful. It lends a special kind of power to that Raj Yoga.
Wow.
So there's kind of a complete Raj Yoga being formed by this new moon. But what I would look at for the individual, of course, not everyone is going to be so powerfully impacted here.
Right.
But first and very simply, I would look, is your ascendant either Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, or Aquarius? And if this new moon falls in one of your angles, then this Raj Yoga effect may be manifested. But again, as with the new moon, it may just be that the effects of the Raj Yoga to come are just being planted, and you will see them come in over time as the moon fills up with light. And of course, you have to see the natal chart. Do you have Raj Yoga potential in your natal chart? Do your dasha promise anything? Yada, yada, yada. But the potential is there. So there's a period where if you have some promise of that, it may manifest. So look especially to your angles and trines in your chart.
Right.
Now, one other things that I wanted to touch upon, and I'll just touch upon everything that I wanted kind of briefly here. One other thing is that, as James pointed out, the malefics are kind of, well, I would look at the malefics as not necessarily, they can often destroy, yes, but think about Saturn, for example. Saturn does not destroy. Saturn preserves, actually. Saturn is the
right. Yeah, I just meant from. Sorry. I'll let you finish your thoughts, Alex. I'm sorry to interrupt you, and then I'll expound on that.
That's okay. And so, personally, I consider it's very much in line with what you said, James. But personally, I would consider the benefics having gentle, soft, cuddly energy, kind of, and the malefics having harsh energy. But the malefics can build, they can produce gains, they can produce good things. They just do so through harsh energy, right?
Yeah.
As when you break your back to work for something that you want. And then Venus is the kind that you just receive that as a gift, or it just comes to you, or someone, but the benefics can also cause some trouble. Think of
Too much
example.
sugar.
Yeah, tooth decay.
Yeah.
That's
Too much
Venus.
candy.
That's Venus in your second house all day, right? And so, yeah, benefics can cause good or bad, but benefics are kind of like with gentle, soft, yummy energy, and malefics are kind of the energy that you don't want to really deal with on the spot. And so, yeah, I really forget what I was going to build on with this, but I'm going to pass. I'm going to pass to this very interesting. Oh yes, I wanted to touch on the nakshatra as well. So.
And what are nakshatras?
So basically, the nakshatra is the sidereal division of 27 portions of space. Just like, there's this debate of whether to use the sidereal or the tropical zodiac. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you use the tropical 12-sign zodiac. There is no other zodiac than the tropical 12-sign, which is prescribed in the most ancient Vedic scriptures. You will only find the tropical zodiac. No mention of any kind of sidereal 12-sign zodiac is found. And then you have the 27 nakshatra, which are divisions which are mainly, divided by the moon, right? 27, that's the number of the moon.
That's its cycle, roughly.
The cycle
27,
of the moon, right?
28. Yeah, and there's actually 28 mansions in some divisions.
Yeah, but the sun also progresses. Like, there's this whole thing which we should not go into. But it depends really, because the nakshatra is sidereal, it depends where you start to count the nakshatras from, right? And depending on the ayanamsha that you use, this new moon could actually fall in Anuradha. And for the ayanamsha that I use, it does fall in Anuradha. So it's very interesting that you mentioned this nakshatra being the nakshatra of friendship, of soft energy, but it's also associated with a shimmering light or a spark. It's like the spark of success.
Awesome.
And the new moon, of course, is an initial spark in that sense. So I think that's very interesting. One other thing which is quite interesting is that the ruler of this new moon is going to square Pluto, and I actually just noticed this as we were talking before going on to record this video, and I think this is very, very important to look at. Mars squaring Pluto, I think some powerful, potentially destroying energy, but also Pluto serves to remove things which are decaying, which we no longer need, and that's of course also with the new moon. So yeah.
Right. Totally.
Yeah, and then Venus is antishal conjunction very close to the South Node, which also, has kind of not the same as Pluto. South Node to me is more like Neptune, but it's sort of like a purifying quality in a sense. I sort of imagine the dragon's tail, that is K2, like whipping itself around because it needs to be, it wants to reside in stillness. And so when other planets and things are with it, it's like, it just like whips around uncontrollably to like sort of destroy those things so that it can return to stillness.
Well, that's cool. And let's see. So, just like briefly going back to this idea of malefic versus benefic, I guess like what I was trying to like frame for everyone was like the idea of, this not necessarily being good or bad, but being like in this like function of a role, right? So they play a certain role. And, I agree with everything you said, Alex. And I also want to point out to everyone that you can really think of the planets like you do the aspects in astrology. And because everything that you would say about Jupiter really fits with this idea of the trine. And the
Mm-hmm.
trine is 120 degrees, and it represents like a very easy flowing energy. It's very like smooth, and it just everything flows.
Abundant.
Right, exactly. It's like a spout that's just like open and just flows.
Yeah.
And Venus is like the sextile, in which it's kind of like this spout, you have to turn it on for it to flow, but it's easy to flow once you turn it on. And that's like a sextile. And then the square is related to Mars, and the energy of a square is separating, or somehow like dynamic or challenging, in which the energy is kind of like trapped. But if it's released, it's released with a lot of force. And then Saturn being like the opposition, in which it requires a great deal of balance and also negotiation in order to get anything to work at all. So just wanted to throw that out there about the malefic versus benefic idea, and how it relates to aspects in astrology.
Cool.
So and yes, Saturn can definitely preserve things in regard to like this idea of Saturn solidifying things and materializing things. So Saturn is connected to the idea of the material world, which makes me think of this idea of Medusa again, and turning things to stone. And it also kind of makes me think that perhaps Saturn is, Medusa in this kind of setup here. And so anyway, I'll just throw that out there, and maybe we can go somewhere with it later. I don't know. But so Lars, what are your thoughts?
I don't want to go anywhere with Medusa.
You don't want to get along with
well,
Medusa, huh?
I don't know. I mean, it'd be fun to get into like every house and things. We probably don't have enough time to do that. But another thing I noticed was the bound of the lunation in Scorpio, which we talked about in an earlier video. The bound is Saturn. So we do, bringing it back to Saturn, have kind of like a Saturnic theme of like loss, depression, inactivity, but also like deep contemplation, and solitude and things like that. So oh yes, and the moon being technically, we could call it like being void of course, because it's not going to bump into anything after the lunation, before it gets to Sagittarius. So it's interesting because what does that mean more practically? I mean, it kind of just means, I think that there could be a tendency to, once again, like easily drift off into difficult thoughts, especially with that algol opposition. That, to me, that algol thing is really big. And another thing I noticed, I found out, is I'm pretty sure this is correct. Algol is in the nakshatra of Kritika, which is basically, its symbol is like a sharp cutting object, and Kritika means like something like cutting, and its deity is Agni, in contrast to Indra Agni, which I talked about earlier. It's just Agni, and of course Agni is the celestial fire, and so it deals with purification, and it also has to do with digestion of food. And we do see some second house stuff going on with Saturn there, so some difficulty with digestion of not only literally food, but of what's going on in the world, and what's going on is not looking very pretty. It's looking very Pluto Mars more and more every day. And so it's I think for me, that theme of not getting caught up in that kind of, like the violent interplay of what's going on in the world, and the true role of Agni is like, complete spiritual purification, kind of like Pluto. It's this fire that burns away everything that isn't us. And so
Right.
we're seeing that in the world. We're seeing this divine fire burning away everything, and it's not in such a pretty form. It's like, it's through like war and death and needless violence, gun violence, because guns are like a fire. And then this makes me think of like the concept of the conflagration, which is like, last cycle God destroyed everything with the flood, and this cycle he's supposed to destroy everything with fire. And so it's not to say that like the people doing the killing or the people being killed, it's like not, I'm not trying to say like, oh well, that's just God doing that, so it's okay. Like, no, that's the form that this purification is taking, because man consciously is not in a high place right now. He's in a low place. And so
Well,
instead of it coming perhaps in a different form, it's unfortunately coming through it's like I'll shut up in a second, but
right.
it's like if you receive a profound truth, okay, like an intuition, let's say, and intuition by definition has to be true. So let's say you receive some intuitive thing, okay, but then what do you do with the intuition? Does it get filtered through your moral system, your values, your ideas? And does it become corrupted in the process? Well, oftentimes that does happen. That happens. Somebody receives this great truth and then they pervert the truth, or they make it theirs. And that's the myth of Orion too. He gets his sight back after being blinded due to stupidity. And then he, instead of being like, becoming a servant of the divine, he becomes arrogant and says, well, I can destroy anything. I can destroy all the beasts. And so it's kind of like this purification is happening. And because man is resistant to the purification, it takes the form of violence and madness and death and killing. And that's kind of what I wanted to say about that.
Well, Alex, is it okay if I share something real quick?
Sure. Go right ahead.
Well, I was just, when you're talking about this is like exactly what I was talking to a group about at the beginning of the month, in reference to the lunation that happened right before the mass shooting in Las Vegas, and how Mars and Venus were conjunct in Virgo, and Virgo being related to this idea of purification, and Mars being violence, and Venus being other people. And how like there was probably some sort of like, mental process going on with that guy, in which he, thought that he was doing something to purify humanity in some way. Obviously, like, in a very misguided and violent manner.
Yeah.
But, this is what I was telling them, and I think this still rings true now, is that we should all be very consciously aware of what we're passing on. Like, are we passing on the wounds and trauma that we experienced when we were young? And are we like, when we meet people, are we giving them that? Or are we like, calling in light to purify those experiences and passing on love to others? And I just want to throw that out because it's like literally what I was talking about, and literally the things I was saying to this group not long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. So
thanks. Yeah, thank you.
That's pretty interesting that you also picked up on this idea just by looking at some of these other chart placements. So,
yeah.
Alex, what are you thinking about now?
Well, since we were talking about some world events and the mass shootings that went on over there in the United States, and of course here in Europe we had a bunch of other terrorist attacks that don't even get reported anymore. Like,
right.
It's like everyday stuff. Right? This is the era that we live in. Like mass shootings and terrorist attacks.
No kidding.
The age of Rahu is what I call it.
Well,
yeah. Well, I would like to call it the age of Mercury in a way, because of all the technology and all of the knowledge coming through as well.
Sure.
But it's kind of the age of each and every planet getting amplified to the maximum, really.
Yeah.
But if I just look at this, I was just looking at this and seeing, well, if this was the chart of an event, what would it be? And if we're talking about conflicts, and of course there's and by the way, I was just thinking, oh wow, that star that you mentioned, the fixed star that you mentioned, that's really interesting. I wonder,
Algol or Rigel?
Algol, yeah. And then I was thinking, oh, that's my ascendant. Wow.
Oh yeah, it is, huh?
mm-hmm.
And so yeah, if I were to look at this chart and see, okay, so Mars rules this. There's this new moon. There's Mars rules this.
Yeah.
We have Mars in the 12th house. There's Libra, there's kind of balance, there's kind of politics, there's kind of diplomacy, agreements, disagreements with Mars there. Venus comes into Scorpio. Mars squares Pluto in the third house. The third house is the house of action, of activity, of what we do, of where we put our action, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So with this new moon, I wouldn't usually try to predict something like this, but there might be a new world conflict being sparked with
Right.
this event right now, and it may have to do with like political,
Sure.
Right.
political pushes and pulls. And I'm thinking of the Middle East, like the whole North Korea thing. I never saw it materializing into an actual conflict. It's just a buildup, right? It's just the whole purpose of it is just the buildup itself. There's no actual end result to this. Just the perpetual buildup of forces, of menaces, or of whatever. But then here, there's some things going on which really do not involve the Western powers, and especially the United States, except as a third party, going on in the Middle East. And I'm kind of thinking that, there might be something sparking in relation to that, but we'll see. I don't usually try to look for events like this to predict, but that's a possibility. And again, with these Raj yogas, a Raj yoga is a yoga of power. Raj means power, right? Or dominion, domination. So it can be good for the individual many times, but when we talk about power on a world stage, it's not usually something that the average Joe would jump all around about.
Sure.
So that's my thoughts when coming to the world stage. I think, on a personal level, we've pretty much covered a lot of what could be useful for the average.
And then Rahu, that made me notice how like the nodes are forming a Rashi based aspect to Mars, the ascendant lord. And that's basically, for those of you who don't know, fixed signs always aspect cardinal signs and vice versa, except the ones next to them. And then the mutable signs all aspect one another. And I would say here, Rahu is a little more powerful in its aspect to Mars than Ketu because of some simple Jaimini techniques that I won't go into. But so Rahu is going to, be an agitating influence to Mars, and kind of, maybe give some more testimony to what you just said, even about Pluto. Rahu is... Mars Rahu is, that becomes easily a combination for violence and things like that. And
right.
So.
Right. And I guess we're getting close to the end, but I just wanted to, think about this idea of Mercury is, very tight aspect to Mars too, in a sextile, and then Mercury is also making an aspect to the North Node or Rahu, this right here, whatever you want to say. So there's obviously some sort of exchange going on, some sort of interaction between the idea of Libra and Mars. So what is that like? It can be arguments or heated situations with other people and your relationships. So, arguments and fighting with others. And then Mercury in Sagittarius is very much being very vocal about one's personal truth or ideologies.
Yeah.
And then, with Rahu up here in Leo, we have this idea of, okay, so something is being eclipsed, something is being overshadowed. There's something we can't see, and it would be, with the lunation in the first house, by whole sign, this would be in the 10th, and so it's connected to authority, right? So, so there's something maybe going on behind the scenes that we're not really aware of right now, which really ties into this idea of Scorpio, and I think that perhaps we'll start seeing these events unfolding at the next full moon, and manifestation of what was going on behind the scenes, involving perhaps political leaders, and ideological differences. And, you know, it really, I mean, obviously being an American, it makes me think of, you know, how Donald Trump is very, like, I guess, vocal to share his personal truth, whatever that may be. And so I was getting the same kind of like thoughts, Alex, about potential conflict. But what are your kind of final thoughts on this, Alex?
So, you know, basically, I would not leave anyone with. There is always potential of conflict, and as we said, especially in our times, like conflict is everywhere. You cannot really shut your eyes to it. You cannot deny it. We should learn to not fuel it around ourselves in the extent that we can. But again, for the individual, this new moon is a good time to introspect. Introspection, clear things, clear emotions, clear psychological baggage. You know, perform a surgery, because there's Venus and there's Jupiter in Scorpio as well. Perform surgery on your inner space, on your inner, you know,
Right.
your emotions, your psychology. Perform some sort surgery there. That's kind of the final advice that I have for the individual. And don't expect this new moon to come with some massive energy and overwhelm you with some events. That's very, very unlikely to happen
Mhm.
unless some other planet activates points in your chart, or
Sure,
unless
yeah.
this is really, really like aligned to your angles, or one of your planets. Otherwise, don't expect this to be any massive, you know, manifest event. Just go within, and I'm sure you will find something to work with if you give yourself some time to do that. What would you say about this, Lars?
Well, kind of the final thing I was noticing that we didn't really get to was the planet with the highest degree is Saturn. So that's the soul planet of the chart. And so we have both the ascendant Lord Mars and the soul planet Saturn in dark houses, meaning they're in houses or signs that don't cast a regular aspect to the ascendant, that being in this case the 12th and the 2nd. So I think that really complements well what you were just saying, Alex, because it's like there really is going to be this need to stop focusing so much on what's going on outside and
Totally.
really go within. And because we're right now collectively, this new moon is like a person who's really blind to who and what they are and what they're involved in, what they're doing. So it's like if you get the abundant fortune signified by these powerful Raj yogas, which are, it's a rare configuration actually, because they're not interrupted by any other planet. So they're just full on Raj yogas. And it's like, you know, you could get these great abundant things or blah, blah, blah. And then you start to focus, you receive them through the lens of suffering. It's like a friend of mine who they cannot eat sweets because they start to feel good, and they mostly live in a mentality of guilt and anger. And so when they start to eat sweets and they start to feel good, it's not in phase with the vibration they've set up every day of their life. So, you know, this is like a real deal kind of thing where when we're really blind to what's going on, you know, we start to receive things into our life unconsciously. And another friend of mine says you've got, you know, you've got a better chance of being struck by lightning than of your unconscious coming through and allowing you to receive things in an auspicious, conscientious way. It's like, you know, spinning like a big wheel or something, and hoping and praying that it just things work out. It's like, no, we gotta be doing the active work of you know, really dealing with our unconscious patterns all the time, and not just at this new moon, but since this is obviously a theme here, you know, we're talking about it. So that, I guess that'll be, you know, my kind of closing thoughts.
Yeah, totally. And I guess my closing thoughts on this really aligns with what you guys are saying. And I think that it's also important to realize that things in the outside world typically have their origin from within. And so, you know, I'm really like kind of parroting a lot of things that you were just talking about, Lars. But this is something I tell my clients a lot is like, hey, you got in an argument with your neighbor, but it's not really about that. It's about something else. And if you can, you know, uncover places within yourself in which you're in conflict or you feel insecure or whatever it is, then perhaps some of these things will not manifest in such a very loud way in your outer life. And I think this lunation is a really good time to focus on the hidden things or the things that you haven't investigated fully, because I consider Scorpio to be a sign associated with investigation. And especially looking beneath the surface of things. So, get in touch with what's underneath, meditate, contemplate, do something spiritual that helps you draw within yourself. I would also say that this would be a good time for you to work with a professional like an astrologer or a hypnotherapist or even a counselor or some type of spiritual help, minister, servant, or something to help you to get a better understanding of where your outer situations are flowing from.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So anyway, so that was my final thoughts on this. This was a really, yeah.
That just made me want to throw in one more thing. I guess, like, it popped in my head as you were speaking. Like, the dream work popped into my head. Like, let your dreams, maybe let some things that could work out in life work out in your dreams, and the way you do that is just by asking. But the other part of it is, like, I guess to sum up kind of what I've been saying through this whole video is, like, this is a time to be really careful not to identify with other people's suffering.
Oh my God, that's perfect. Yeah,
like,
totally.
Don't take that on and be like pissed off that, oh, there was another shooting or there was this other sexual thing in the news. Like, yes, it's really horrible stuff, but we cannot identify with that. Otherwise, we just get pulled into it like a black hole. So.
And on that note, it's also a great time to subscribe to this YouTube channel and check out the links in the description and all that stuff. And I guess, James, I'll let you close this video. That it was a bit of a dark note here, but then again, it's a new moon in Scorpio, so I think that's perfectly proper.
But and also I think that it's important. Just one final thing, and then we'll really close. But I think it's important to also honor the darkness in the world and to acknowledge it, because I think that once we become aware of things, that's when we can bring the most light to it. And so encountering the darkness, I think, is very fruitful during this lunation cycle, but especially while the sun and all these planets are making their way through Scorpio. Get in touch with the darkness that you haven't been confronting, and then you can bring some light to those spaces. But anyway, so this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much to Alex and Lars, and we will see you guys very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.